Good morning, Dr. Rashid. Thank you.
Good morning. How are you?
কপাট ভেঙে ফেলে করলে লোপাট রক্ত জমাট শিকল পূজার পাষাণ বেদী বাজে তোরে প্রলয় বিষাণ ধ্বংস নিশান উরূপ প্রাচীর প্রাচীর বেদী কারা রইল কপাট কারা রইল কপাট
বাজনা বাজা কে মালিক কে সে রাজা গাজনের বাজনা বাজা কে মালিক কে সে রাজা
কে গায় সাজা মুক্ত স্বাধীন সত্য রে হা 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 পায় যে হাসি হা 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 পায় যে হাসি ভগবান করবে ফাঁসি সর্বনাশী শিখায় এই তত্ত্বকে রে কারা রইল কপাট কারা রইল কপাট কারা রইল কপাট কারা রইল কপাট
ভোলা দেরে দে প্রলয় দোলা ভোলা দেরে দে প্রলয় দোলা
গারদ গুলা জোরসে ধরে হ্যাচকা টানে মার হাত হায়দারি হাত মার হাত হায়দারি হাত কাঁধে বন্দুকে ডাক ডাক করে ডাক মৃত্যুকে ডাক জীবন পানে কারা রইল কপাট কারা রইল কপাট কারা রইল কপাট কারা রইল কপাট দেখি ভীম কারার ওই ভিত্তি নারী লাথি মারে ভাঙলে তালা লাথি মারে ভাঙলে তালা যত সব বন্দিশালায় আগুন জ্বালা ফেলু কারি কারা রইল কপাট কারা রইল কপাট ভেঙে ফেলে করবে লোপাট রক্ত জমাট শিকল পূজার ভাষণ বেদী ওরে ও তরু নিশান ওরে ও তরু নিশান বাজা করে প্রলয় নিশান ধ্বংস নিশান গুরু প্রাচীর প্রাচীর বেদী কারা রইল কপাট 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 কারা রইল কপাট
Good morning and happy Friday. I'm Mustahid Husain at the Center for South Asian Studies, Asian Institute at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Welcome to the webinar, Student-Led Bangladesh 2.0, Debt, Development and Democracy. Bangladesh is at the cusp of changes and remains polarized. July 2024 student uprising was the straw that broke the camel's back, they say. We acknowledge during the student uprising, 1,581 Bangladeshis, including children and elderly, gave their lives. Also, approximately 31,000 Bangladeshis were injured. Unofficial numbers are much higher. As we reflect on the profound sacrifice made during this pivotal moment in Bangladesh's history, we are compelled to examine its implications for the nation's current transition and future trajectory. We are honored to have a distinguished panel of experts who will offer their insights and perspectives on this critical juncture in Bangladesh's socio-political landscape. First, Dr. Debapriya Bhattacharya is a Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Policy Dialogue in Dhaka. He is a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy and the founding chair of the LDC Monitor and Southern Voice. Dr. Naomi Hossain is a global research professor in the Department of Development Studies and the director of the SOAS Development for Transformation Center. Dr. Farida Chowdhury Khan serves as a professor of economics at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. Michael Kugelman is the director of South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Dr. Fahim Quadir holds the positions of the Dean and Vice-Provost of Graduate Studies as well as Professor of Global Development Studies at Queen's University. Finally, Dr. Selim Rashid is a Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. We are also joined by audience members from all over the world. A few people to thank before we begin: Arba Bardi, Professor Francis Cody and Firat Boskali at the University of Toronto, and Professor Harun Akram Lodhi, former Chief Editor at the Canadian Journal of Development Studies, for their input in setting up today's webinar. Our webinar has three themes: governance of the Bangladesh state, military, and political parties, the country's debt and debt repayment, and finally, youth empowerment and engagement. These themes will intersect populist discourse, privatization, and geopolitics. The reason governance took priority as a theme because Bangladesh's parliament can now be compared to a British museum, as Shashi Tharoor calls them Chor Bazaar or active crime scene. Paraphrasing Voltaire, other countries have political parties, but in Bangladesh, two political parties have a country. An audience member remarks in Bangla, Nouka ar dhaner shish, dui shap eki rish, which can mean in English, boat and paddy seed that represent these two political parties are essentially two snakes with the same venom. Words on the street are that one has overeaten and the other one is famished. How does Bangladesh move on from here? We picked Bangladesh's international debt and debt repayment as a theme because the country's international debt increased 5 times in the last 15 years. Presently, repayment of debt encompasses 21% of the national budget. Finally, youth empowerment and engagement in Bangladesh took priority as a theme because the average age for Bangladeshis is around 28 years. Not a single academic institution in the country ranks among the top global 500. Over the past 15 years, the government has allocated more funds on purchasing surveillance technology for monitoring citizens than it has invested in academic research and support for entrepreneurship. No wonder that Elon Musk's and Peter Thiel's of Bangladesh are yet to flourish. How does Bangladesh move on from here? We will start with hearing from each panelist, with Dr. Debapriya Bhattacharya first, regarding their vision they have for Bangladesh's future state and development once the interim government concludes its tenure. After that, we plan to have 2 rounds of questions for the panelists. Given we have extra time, we will answer questions shared by the members of the audience. Dr. Bhattacharya, thanks again for connecting from all the way from Bangladesh. Please share your views. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever is suitable. Thank you, Mustahid Husain, for inviting me to this August gathering. I'm very, very privileged to have the opportunity to join such a celebrated set of panelists over here. I know most of them and have high regards for their intellect and their contribution. I am in a car and the connection is not exactly ideal, and there is high post-monsoon rain going on in Bangladesh at this moment, as there is a low pressure in the Bay of Bengal. Similarly, possibly there is a low pressure also within the mainland in Dhaka or Bangladesh. So thank you for the question. Mustahid, if you allow me, I would have disagreed with some of the, those stylized facts you have put up to describe my country. I would have described it possibly in a different way. And there are possibly much beyond the venoms of the snakes and for that matter, the struggles of the people. in that way. But that, let us leave it for another occasion. Looking forward. So you see, my first point is that quite often people say the way the revolution has happened in Bangladesh is an exception. And particularly the speed at the end of the final phase with which the change took place and how the leader fled the country. What I wanted to say is that what has happened in Bangladesh is no exception. If you look into the history of most of the authoritarian regimes and how do they end, then you will find, and how do they emerge, they develop, and they end, you will find many similarities amongst them. Particularly as an economist, I can tell you how the economy takes shapes under them. How do they go for visible indicators of development in order to compensate for the democratic deficits. And as a result, they really cannot generate enough domestic resources and even cannot finance private investment, leading to lack of jobs, particularly for the young people, and lack of investment in the education, which can give quality education to prepare these young people for much more market remunerating jobs. So if we want to understand why this revolution has taken place, we'll have to go down and see the development paradigm pursued by the authoritarian regime over the decade or so in that way. Now, building on that, when we do look into the future, obviously the aspiration of the younger generation will be on the top of the agenda. And that is what you see, what is happening at this moment. And all our future programs and aspirations do include the voice of the young people in many ways. Many people are not very comfortable with that. It may not be done in a very neat way, but that is what we will have to accept, that the voice of the youth will be of paramount importance in shaping the future. This is one. If you look at the women's approach, and I'm an woman, you addressed. And what if I can reconstruct what is there in the mind of the government or what is coming out from the chief advisor, then we are at a moment of stabilization, trying to restore peace, stability, law and order, trying to make the public service institution more operational, functionable. So all these things are happening. There is an inherited problem. There is what I call the legacy issues, but also there are new things which has emerged because of the way we have to change the government. So that is there. From there, we move into what we call now on the reform discourse. And from to going into the reform discourse, you have seen I lead the white paper initiative. There are 6 others who will be now running the commissions. There are many other committees set up in different ministries with specific tasks in hand. So this is where the designing phase of the reforms are coming into existence. Why the reforms? I think it is related to the nature of the change. People are not interested in repeating, creating a country or staying with the country which reincarnation authoritarian system, which really subdues the freedom of speech, the ability of human beings on their own accord. So I think the reform issue is one of the key. To which much one is anti-discrimination in the broadest sense of the term, and the other the anti-discrimination to hopefully to a situation where there will be a working consensus within the country through consultation, discourse, and debates, which will allow us to move towards an election and to implement some of the reform that will take us to national elections, hopefully participatory, free and fair, and possibly within some new parameters of constitutional and regulatory and administrative opportunities within which. So that is the timeline or the pathway which you are looking for. The aspiration at the end of the day, as I said, to achieve a country take opportunities for everybody when suffer from both from structural discrimination as well as from policy-induced discrimination or political victimization. That is the aspiration, and that's the pathway which we aspire for in the coming day, in the year or two, to happen in that way. It is an interrelated process between, there is a technical part of it, but we should not forget the political part of it. To what extent the political process will support this is something which we will see, and the leadership will work it out. Thank you. I'll stop over here.
Thank you, Bhattacharya. Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. The call dropped a little bit in between, but what we gathered was through reform, anti-discrimination, leading to election when the interim government concludes its tenure. Thank you again for sharing your insights. Dr. Hussain, Dr. Naomi Hussain, would you kindly able to share what are your insights and vision for the interim government?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. You know, we first had these conversations, I think, over a year ago. We were planning this event. So it's great that it's finally happened, and it's happened in such a very different political scenario than in which it was originally planned. I think like Dr. Bhattacharya, I would like to emphasize the fact that there is a balance, I think, of necessary aspiration with both feasibility and likelihood that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about what the vision for the state might be after this reform period. And for me, and I say, you know, not just me, many of the political scientists, political sociologists that I work with and do research with, we agree that what is absolutely essential is a more dispersed distribution of political power. It must never again be the case that political parties, and in particular the ruling party, has such a stranglehold on political power in future. We know political power comes from the people. The people must be able to hold on to enough of that power, even after elections, that they are in a position to call those parties to heel when they start to violate due process, when they start to violate human rights and the basic norms of political governance, which 100% they will do if we simply have an election and start again. So we do need some political reforms in Bangladesh. And it's not clear to me yet that the 6 commissions that have been assigned have the mandate or the capacity to do that. I'm also very pleased that Dr. Bhattacharya spoke about the process. I think the process of all of this is really critical. There must be faith in the process. It must be transparent. Above all, it must be inclusive and equitable. And, you know, I'm very impressed by there's a platform that Dr. Bhattacharya and other civil society leaders have been developing over a number of years, this SDGs Citizens Platform, which is the kind of space, I think, in which these reforms need to be discussed. I think what would this aspiration for the state look like? Well, a couple of things. One is, I think, some recognition in the popular political culture that democracy is not just about elections, and it's not just about having one party and then another party and then the other party again. It is much more than that. Citizens must feel they have the right and the capacity to demand answers. They must be able to engage with their state. It means also non-party and non-state institutions of accountability that safeguard and oversee things like public recruitment, police complaints, energy policies, and so on. Other countries have these. They do work. So we can try those in Bangladesh. We actually have a lot of provision for this in the constitution and the policies. They haven't really been enacted in the way that they might be, but partly because of everything becoming politicized and turned to parties in the last few years. But it also important is a political system in which when you lose an election, you do not lose everything. You do not lose your liberty. You do not lose your business, your house. You don't have to go into exile. We have to get away from a winner-takes-all politics, because with a winner-takes-all politics, the stakes are so high with every election that the loser is devastated. You cannot possibly stomach losing. It means that there's a lot of violence and contention. If we have a shift in democratic political culture towards a less winner-takes-all system, I think that will be really important. And just finally, on the on what the new state should look like, I hope after this interim government is complete with its reform work, is I think an enriched, a revitalized civil society in the broadest sense. I know that civil society is not always a popular term these days in Bangladesh, but I think that support for youth movements, for farmer movements and agrarian movements, and in particular for trade unions, I think is a crucial thing in Bangladesh. Trade unions are the bedrock of any democratic system. And in Bangladesh, we've seen what's happened when workers don't have correct and proper representation to represent their rights and claim their rights. So those are some of the things that, one of the reasons, of course, the Awami League regime got so bad was that civil society was so weakened. Deliberately so. That was a deliberate target because civil society had been so weak. Just one word on what the development situation should look like after this interim government. I agree with Dr. Bhattacharya, absolutely massive investment in education. We don't have any natural resources. We have people. We are very brilliant and very enthusiastic and patriotic young people, and they are being denied the kind of education that they deserve. I'll leave that there.
Thank you, Dr. Hussain, for building upon on Dr. Bhattacharya's insights. You added that democratic process should not be a number game the way it has been played. It should be based on participatory process and outcome. One of the outcomes is revitalized civil society and massive investment on education. And it's like this adds lots of glamour to the conversation. Now we are looking up to Dr. Farida Khan. Dr. Khan, thank you again for joining us. Would you share your insights for the new state in terms of policies and development?
Thank you again, Mustahid, for having me join this very distinguished group. And one thing I will say is that there's certainly a big difference between somebody on the ground being part of the reforms as Dr. Bhattacharya is currently. And it would be wonderful if we could hear some of the activities that are going on currently so we could respond to them as well, because, we're far away and we're basically watching these events unfold. I will start by saying that this is clearly a new opportunity again for Bangladesh to cleanse itself of the past and reinvent itself as it has done over and over for centuries. What is notable is that very few people knew about the extent to which the Hasina government and its cronies had terrorized people and looted people, because there's so many facts that came out during this process. And prior to this, we weren't even sure that what we were hearing, whether it was true or not. But clearly a lot of things have come out, which was interesting because after the 2010s, Bangladesh had started to grow so well and done so well with the Human Development Index. We were all very excited about how well it was doing. And also by 2020, it had exceeded all the other countries in its GDP per capita and so on. So, now that we're better aware of what happened during the Hasina regime, we wonder how much better Bangladesh would have done without the extent of the corruption that we had. If we can, of course, believe the data. So there's that as well. The question always emerges, as you pointed out at the beginning, is that is corruption endemic to a particular regime, or is it rooted in the society? And no matter who comes to power, will it be back? So, people in Bangladesh are very aware of the failure of their institutions. I'm somewhat critical of how much Bengalis sort of scold themselves. And perhaps, they need to start believing in themselves a little bit more. But they are very inventive in how they reimagine anything. So at this point, the interim government is reforming the administration, the judiciary, the police, and creating all these commissions as well. So we're hoping that these will move towards better governance and accountability, because the problem is the institutions, clearly, and not much else. So are we going to be able to create something that will be lasting, that will provide this anti-discrimination kind of platform that we're talking about, which is inherent in the country anyway? I mean, it's not that, we have, there's really no capture of power by any particular religious group or any particular community. We are already, fairly broad-based and anti-discriminatory. So the point here is that, are we going to be able to transition to having fair elections? Are there political parties that can come up and participate? And when will the interim government be ready to have these elections? So what I'm most curious about is, what is the interim government doing to take us in that direction? Because the demographic dividend without the jobs is not a problem of Bangladesh alone. It persists in many places. So we're not. I'm not absolutely sure that the lack of jobs has to do with autocracy. Maybe it's just a condition of this particular economy. So I will leave it at that and continue later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. You raised some important insights that lasting institutions that are confident and innovative. And you asked about the processes. In our next round of questions, we will dig deeper into those processes from our panelists. Thank you again for sharing your insights. Now the mic is open to Michael Kugelman. Michael, what are your insights for the new state?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And it really is an honor to be a part of what really is a dream team of Bangladesh scholars. So it's really an honor for me to be a part of it. And indeed, I know that there have been discussions about having this conversation for about a year now. So glad it's all come together, and congrats to you. So, to your question, I think it's very tempting to be very hopeful and to dare to be really optimistic. What happened in Bangladesh is truly remarkable, that a mass movement led by students ousted a repressive, seemingly entrenched government, and that it was replaced by a revered Nobel laureate and a new administration, a new interim administration that has several students playing meaningful roles within the government. I mean, this is a remarkable achievement for youth politics and for so many things. This has understandably seeded a lot of hope that Bangladesh is now poised to usher in a reality that has long been elusive, and that would entail, among other things, youth-led politics, respect for rights, equality, dignity, clean governance, and so on and so forth. And I think it's an especially tempting positive vision to hold, because we have seen this movie in so many other places, and yet the ending has not been happy. So, I view this Generation Z movement as a people power movement. There have been people power movements around the world, quite a few of them in recent decades, from the Philippines, which tends to be described as the first case, to various cases in Central Asia, and then, of course, the Middle East with the Arab Spring. These movements have produced dramatic political change, but not lasting democratic consolidation. So I think it's tempting to think, well, maybe Bangladesh can buck this trend, and that can be the interim government's legacy when it concludes its tenure, whenever that may be. But I think we can all agree that how difficult it would be to get to that point. First, there's several reasons why. The parties that have benefited from this new political reality, particularly the BNP and Jamaat, they are not exactly paragons of democracy based on their past track records. Second, there are hardline Islamist actors that have now been given more political space, even if nowhere near the scale that many commentators in India are suggesting. Third, the army clearly does not have an interest in being a major political actor, but several factors, the large political vacuum in place, the lack of governing experience within the interim government, and especially a law and order situation that remains tenuous, all this means that one cannot rule out down the road the army taking on more of a role by necessity rather than by choice. Fourth, the security agencies, the security institutions that were complicit in so many brutalities over the years remain intact. And fifth, and finally, the politics of retribution, so entrenched in Bangladesh's polarized politics, have really shown no signs of subsiding. Something that I think could have implications for both political stability and law and order. So I think that if the interim government is to succeed at restoring and especially consolidating democracy, and I certainly hope that it is successful, of course, and they're fulfilling that hopeful vision that so many of us would like to have about Bangladesh, it'll need to take some difficult steps for sure. And I'll just highlight a few as I see them. First, it will need to figure out how to deal with the issue of the politics of retribution, so to speak. It will need to renounce them and move on from that. That will be very difficult because there is, of course, major importance in justice and ensuring that those that broke laws and did so many terrible and unlawful things in the previous regime are held to account. So a balance will need to be struck between genuine steps toward justice and accountability and politically driven vendettas meant to go after anyone suspected of having supported the Awami League. And given the level of polarization in politics in Bangladesh, I think that striking that balance might be tougher than it may seem. Second, the interim government will need to deal with this sensitive issue of the radical Islamists. It can't just assume that it can be ignored or that someone else will handle it. Again, this is difficult because how you deal with this challenge itself is a very tough question. Third, the interim government will need to make sure that it does not wear out its welcome, so to speak. For now, I think we could all agree that the country, for the most part, is fully behind it, giving it the benefit of the doubt, wanting to give it the space to do what it needs to do to rebuild and stabilize the country. And that includes the very important reforms plan that was laid out earlier. But, if we look to, say, a year from now, and the economy is continuing to sputter, if the reforms plan is not making ample progress, if law and order remains dicey, under those types of circumstances, public sentiment could well start to sour on the government or grow more impatient, deepening pressure for elections to take place. And I think that the longer that this interim government stays in power, particularly if there's no clear sense of a time frame for when elections could be coming, the more likely it could be that this interim government becomes politically vulnerable, and the more likely we could see heightened risks of social and political instability. And that clearly would not be good for democracy. So I'll end there, send things back to you.
Thank you, Michael. You brought up some important points. Politics of retribution. Professor Bhattacharya termed it as legacy issues articulately, and it's part of the culture. You brought up military. Words on the street are that military is more interested to be part of the UN mission than be involved in active politics. And you compared everything with a beautiful movie. We know the actors, but we don't know who are the directors or if the directors will change behind the screen, right? So all these are, fluid. but you especially also mentioned about Islamization, radicalism. Presently, Malaysian Prime Minister is in Dhaka, and we are told that Prince Salman might visit from Saudi Arabia to Bangladesh. Those are important. These are important trips, and we will learn a lot as they materialize. Now, thanks again. We move on to Professor Quadir. Professor Quadir, what are your insights and hopes and aspirations for the new state?
Thank you, Mustahid. And I really, really want to express my gratitude to you for bringing all of us together. I think you have been working on it for about 18 months. It's a long journey, but I'm so thrilled to be part of this amazing group of esteemed scholars and observers of Bangladeshi politics to discuss the future of democracy and development in Bangladesh. I do have some caveats. I think you touched on some of the bigger challenges, and my colleagues have already shared their thoughts on a number of issues, and I don't think I have much to add. I don't have really what it is necessary for someone like me to offer a vision. I don't think that's really exactly the right thing for me to do. I'm a student of politics, a student of global development, and of course, a native of Bangladesh. So I would address, I think, the issue from a slightly different angle. I do have significant caveats. I think one of the early participants raised that issue. I have to be honest that I'm not really connected to the everyday realities of the country. I'm looking it over from the distance, and I probably have a sort of inaccurate understanding of the realities on the ground. And that's obviously a limitation. But based on my observation, however incomplete they are, I'd like to really share a few thoughts. When I was listening to Michael, I thought about one thing. The interim government has been given an impossible task. I think if we list all of the things that we have already highlighted right here, how could you clear the mess left by the governments in the last 53 years in just about a year or two, or maybe 3 years time frame or so? The entire situation is, in my view, profoundly confusing and extremely complex in the sense that we have been struggling for years, for decades, to find a path to democracy, to find a path to development. And if I can give one example, in the last 5 decades, we have not been able to sort out one, I would consider, a simple task, that is to define our identity. Who am I? I think that question is yet to be resolved. So in a situation like this, I think that the need is for us to rewrite the social contract, and that is precisely what the interim government is asked to do. The reform commissions, etc., would be looking into some of these options. And I tend to think there are 3 different areas where we have to pay a great deal of attention. There are many other things we can discuss, one of which is the failure of the country to institutionalize a form of electoral democracy. And I'm not going into the discussion of liberal democracy, which is a very different kind of conversation. See, in the past, we have had amazing moments to consolidate democracy, and we missed every single opportunity, especially in the last 15 years. Instead of consolidating democracy and giving liberal democracy a chance to survive, we use some democratic institutions to build a pure autocratic state, authoritarian state. And I think that was one of the reasons why we saw it's not just in the last 15 years, it's also in the past, we saw a clear rise of any liberal state. We had not really done much to show our respect for democracy, show respect for human rights, do anything to protect a space for freedom of speech. The rule of law was obviously out of the question. Then I think the second thing is the erosion of trust in public institutions. In the last 15, 16 years, what happened was remarkable for two reasons. Number one, all state institutions that we can think of became the political wings of the ruling party. Political wings. I think you couldn't really separate the political party in power from state machineries. And then the third thing, which in my view is fundamentally important for us to raise a question about, is the separation of the state from the market. I think I don't hear a conversation about the failure of Bangladesh to separate the state from the market. In the last, I think, few years, we have seen the rise of plunder capitalism, and it's being institutionalized. And if you look at the people who are or who were parliamentarians, many of them had no involvement with politics. They were involved with business or cultural politics of the country, and became politicians primarily to advance their narrow political agendas. In most cases, they were there to foster a culture of corruption. I think it's one of the root causes of corruption. And you saw the state lost its complete autonomy vis-a-vis the market, couldn't regulate anything in the domain where the market actors would operate. Indeed, if I had to say, I would probably say it loudly, that the market in Bangladesh became the state. I think that is part of the reason why we saw the institutionalization of corruption, the use of state institutions to advance very personal interest. And this is probably one of the reasons why we saw the celebration of the building of a new patrimonial state in Bangladesh, especially in the last 15 years. So in my view, this is a mess, a huge mess, a completely broken system, a dysfunctional system of governance. And if I are to expect that in a year, 2 or 3, this interim government would be able to resolve all of these issues, I would probably do a big injustice to the interim government. My expectations are fairly limited. If within the time frame of between 3 and 5 years, I see 2 things, then I would be delighted as an individual from Bangladesh, as an individual who cares about democracy and development. That would be to set the conditions, create the conditions for the country's return to electoral democracy. It's the first step toward building a democratic political culture. If we are able to hold free and fair elections, giving people a choice to select the leaders, I think that would be an accomplishment, a major one. And the second one is to restore people's trust in public institutions. Whether we think of civil bureaucracy, think of police, think of judiciary, there is absolutely no trust. So I think we have to really start building these institutions. If we are able to do these 2 things, I think we should be able to put the country back on the track of democracy and development. I should stop right here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Quadir. I think the task for interim government, as you mentioned, is very difficult. I think as difficult as squeezing juice out of powder, it seems, right? Especially with restoring trust and materializing electoral democracy. Our parliamentarians who were supposed to protect people made sure that most of the public resources belong to them and their families. Not that it never happened before in other developing countries, but as Michael Kugelman also mentioned that how we can deliver from this brownie points at the initial to a trophy that remains to be seen. Now, finally, Professor Rashid, thanks for your patience. Sir, what visions do you have for the new state? Would you kindly share?
Thank you, Mustahid. I hope I can be heard clearly. And distinguished panel members, it has been very educational to hear from all of you. My point of view will be, in some ways, quite narrowly economic. And some of these ideas are set out in a booklet that I wrote in 2013, and which were repeated in some recent articles in the Daily Star with Professor Bashar. I'm sure Mustahid can make them available if you want more detail. Now, economics is never separate from politics. And in fact, when I lecture, I always make it clear that economics is subordinate to law, and law is subordinate to politics. So when I speak about economics, it is not because I have forgotten the politics. And one ground on which I have my greatest difference with contemporary literature on development is my belief that the bureaucracy is the backbone of the market. Now, I will not elaborate on this here right now. I want to be much more specific. What do we look for in a constitution? And the only point I wish to make here is that the discussion I hear is always about how does the constitution restrain others. Whereas in my point of view, a constitution is what the Puritans would call a self-denying ordinance. It is a way of saying that democracy is needed because I need to control myself. And I would like to emphasize that that is an understanding which the interim government could do much to emphasize. Now, there has been discussion about economics indirectly so far, directly also, but I have been arguing for many, many years that the way to give or recognize the people who are going to advance is by giving them hope. What gives people hope? In my opinion, right now, the most important thing is to assure them an economic future. If a people can enjoy 10% growth, they will certainly have the possibility of doubling their income in a decade. So if you start off with a real income of 10,000 when you're 20 years old, and this process continues, you will end up with an income of 120,000 by the time you retire at 60. If people can believe this, and if they think that it is a sincere thing, then they will of course have hope, and they will exert the necessary patience and use foresight in what they do. So how is this 10% growth to come about? There are three planks that I have argued about in the past. They are rural urbanization, agriculture-based growth, including a program that tries to make Bangladesh a rice exporter, and emphasis upon high-value, non-traditional agricultural products such as flowers and fruits. And thirdly, as an institutional mechanism to embody these changes, I would like to see the government encourage cooperatives. Such a procedure will automatically decentralize the economy, because you cannot centralize agriculture like you can centralize manufacturing. So that will be a desideratum of the political process. If these goals are worked upon, I think the path forward will be clear, and much of the internecine wrangling that sullies everyday political conversation will be muted. There has been a very welcome movement spearheaded by Dr. Nazrul Islam, to ask for proportional representation, so that if a party wins 45% of the vote, it does not end up with 0% of the power. Something has to happen to give them 45% or thereabouts of the power. And there is no better way to restrain political vengeance than by using other politicians. So let us hope the plan for the political change comes about, and the hope for continuing this process into the future comes about by changing the vision of growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rashid. I will be more than happy to share your articles with the members of the panelists after we conclude here today. And your insight about proportional representation, we can dig deeper into that. In our next round of questions, we are, as Professor Khan wanted to learn more specific processes that are being materialized now, we will start with Dr. Bhattacharya. Professor Bhattacharya, considering your role in preparing the white paper on the state of Bangladesh economy and your expertise in development economics, how do you see the interplay between Bangladesh's debt obligations and its pursuit of sustainable development goals, especially in light of the recent global economic challenges? Professor Bhattacharya?
We might have lost him.
No, my connection is not very good. Hello,
Sir, do
can you hear
want me
me?
to repeat the question?
Yeah, but would you kindly, you can have the questions repeated, please, but there are a number of issues which have been raised by my colleagues. I would have loved to respond to or to engage with them on some of these issues, but we can leave it at that. And so would you kindly repeat the issues? Question, it's about SDGs.
Sure. Considering your role in preparing the white paper on the state of Bangladesh economy and your expertise in development economics, how do you see the interplay between Bangladesh's debt obligations and its pursuit of, SDG, especially in light of the recent global economic challenges? You are also welcome to answer, add some of the colleagues' critiques in this.
So let me start with the white paper and I pick on one of the issues Dr. Farida Khan raised, that everybody was amused or impressed by the development narrative coming from Dhaka. And then she said, if the figures are correct, they are not correct. That is the point of departure of our white paper. That we are investigating the data sets prepared by the government. We are picking up on specific indicators like the GDP growth rate, inflation, debt issue, as you have just mentioned, non-performing loans, capital flight, all these issues, high-ticket there. Now we have for a fact from the development partners, they knew from the very beginning the growth estimates are over projected or over estimated at least by 2%. And that obviously had implication for all the ratios which we have had subsequently, because it is not only they overestimated or declared higher numbers for GDP, which led to lower share of your debt GDP ratio in that sense, debt GDP ratio, which was quite self-defeating, because the ability to service that debt was really very, very difficult in many ways. Now we pay more than $2 billion a year now for debt servicing. It will soon rise to $3 to $4 billion in a year or two. It is much beyond the ability of the government. As you know, the debt issue has this whole our fancy that we have never defaulted on a debt. But the fact of the matter is there are $6 billion unpaid dues at this moment, which is not allowing us to import further fuel or fertilizer or food, and because of the unpaid debts or the dues. And that also creates the problem of opening up new letters of credit for the new investment, which is affecting the private investment and pursuing a contractionary policy to deal with the inflation, which is also controlling the credit growth, supply response problem at the same time. So the debt issue, and if you look at the origin of it in that way, is also the numbers are also villain of the piece. The numbers we touted, we produced, and we use them very opportunistically in many ways. The debt servicing issue, so what we are trying to looking at the debt issue, both from the internal point of view, domestic debt, and also the external debt. And the internal debt is much larger than the domestic debt. And the internal debt are payable to the banks. And since the government is not also paying back, we are having liquidity problem, which is affecting the private sector in their own turn. So the debt issue is to be managed. So how one would, in the white paper, we are trying to look at it, is that on the one hand, how do we improve the fiscal space? And for that matter, for the in the short term, getting access to budgetary support measures. We have been able to do that up to a point through the Asian Development Bank and in the recent commitments in New York from the World Bank. So the improving the fiscal space for the time being, particularly to get ready for the coming budget. It's an option not has been resorted to. And really go to under the G20 provisions for that. Jamaica has done that. Whether Bangladesh would like to do that or not, that is to be upon the balance of payment situation, both with the better flow of remittances and the critical level of the foreign reserve is increasing. The other good news is that in the recent discussion with the IMF we could get a supplementary but we have expressed our interest of the IMF. So as you can see, one is to managing the short-term situation in terms of the balance of payment and dealing with the protecting the fiscal space. But there is also a broader issue which we are looking at it at this moment in the in our white paper and beyond. The others are doing that. That is looking at the specific the treaties which have led to this borrowing, and whether these treaties were adequately has gone through proper due diligence, and whether there had been appropriately considered in the interest of the country, whether they were overpriced projects, which has led to this debt situation, whether the the concessional part and also the other non-credit commitments which were involved that to be looked were proper. How does it compare internationally, and the repayment period, the grace periods, and all these issues are being looked at. Whether there were interest group who have promoted this kind of activities, that is also being seen. So you see, the debt issue is critical in the upcoming future decisions of many of the allocative priorities and beyond, and we are looking at it more from the management point of view, but also in terms of taking lessons for the future. You know, in this case, I just wanted to go back to some of the issues that my colleagues have raised. You see, we should remember this is not the first time in the history of Bangladesh we are having an interim government. There have been at least 3-4 interim governments in the past. If you look at the Shahabuddin government in the 1990, if you even take even in the closure days, 27, 28, the so-called 111 government, and today, in all these cases, these governments, the earlier governments, have been able to go for electoral transition, and that was their short-term view. But they really did not really lead to the consolidation of the democracy, even when we had a more or less a proper election. So the issue is whether we are going to have an election plus, but at the same time, one remains mindful that one should not bite more than it can chew. So this is a dynamic adjustment which is going to go on in the coming days as we move forward, based on pragmatism and aspiration, and and also the ground realities, how it goes. So we will see how these things play out as it goes. Nobody has a silver bullet. It is all about political pragmatism, how the political actors going to help with it, how the non-state actors are going to ensure accountability from the very beginning, and how the international partners will be tolerant and also be understanding, and for how long. So I think it's a very, very difficult game, and not that we don't have any experience, but at the same time, each game is always a new one. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. It's evident that Bangladesh economy is forced to dance on hot coals, and the rest remains to be seen. BRICS next summit is coming up at Kazan in 15th of October. Hopefully that will bring some good news from there. But now we are moving on to Dr. Husain. Dr. Husain, given your expertise with BRAC and your research in political sociology, how do you see the role of NGOs in Bangladesh evolving in relation to youth empowerment and democratic engagement, especially in the context of increasing privatization and populist discourse in Bangladesh?
Well, these are very good and big and important questions, but like Dr. Bhattacharya, I would also like to slightly engage with what's gone before, if that's all right, in answering or trying to answer this question. And one thing that it occurred to me to reflect on a little bit when we're talking about the challenges facing Bangladesh is to recognize that many of these issues that we're talking about here are not exclusive to Bangladesh. We have debt crises leading to mass movements to topple governments in several countries, including in the region, in the past few years. So there is, we're in a particular stage of late capitalism where democracy, even in actual democracies, unlike Bangladesh prior to August, is not functioning well, in which mass movements are necessary, it seems, to hold governments accountable, in which debt really does begin to call the shots politically. Appreciate very much what Dr. Salim said about the fact that economics is always political and politics is always, of course, economic too. And in that light, I wanted to say something about the youth movement that we saw that toppled this recent past Awami League regime. I think that what was very visible was young people, middle-class university students coming out on the streets, and all of the wonderful art and the songs and the creative repertoires, as we call it in political sociology, that caught international and national attention and gave Bangladesh a lot of attention in that time, gave the movement a lot of attention at that time. And I think that, my own research in civil society in Bangladesh in the last few years has shown me that these movements are much broader. It's not just the university's student anti-discrimination movement was the tip of a very large iceberg of youth activism. And so I feel I don't want to talk about NGOs anymore because first, they're much less important than they used to be in Bangladesh. They're still huge, some of them. But aid funding for NGOs is much less important than it was, and they are, in many cases now, very much service providers or doing relatively small-scale activism and advocacy, particularly given that they had no space to operate in the last 10 years or so. But in place of these very formal and really quite famously effective development NGOs, we have seen in the lack of a space for such organizations to emerge, we've seen a much more informal, inchoate kind of youth uprising. And we saw this a lot actually around COVID. Youth and young people, students and others did a lot of volunteering around that time and formed a lot of small grassroots organizations, a lot of very patriotic young people in Bangladesh. And in the absence of any opportunity to get involved in any progressive politics of any kind, they have been setting up these organizations. I've been studying education foundations. There's a whole generation of new types of civil society that has emerged in Bangladesh. And it's important to note also that there is historical precedent for this. In the 70s, Abid Pai and Professor Yunus set up what came to be, world-class institutions of non-state, development innovation. And they did so in a space where there was no space for progressive politics. They would have done maybe, I'm not sure about Professor Yunus, but Abid Pai was famous for saying he would have gone into, he was a Marxist, everyone was a Marxist in the 70s, and he would have gone into politics. But there was no space for that. So what do? You set up an NGO. And here we have something comparable, youth organizing in a space where they couldn't do politics. So I feel very hopeful about that. So that's part of the movement that we saw that toppled the government. The other part of it, though, is and this is where I think my thoughts really connect with those of Dr. Quadir and Michael Kugelman and Dr. Bhattacharya as well, that actually the economic situation is probably the major threat to any kind of political reforms here. And I speak in particular about the inflation, the cost of living crisis, food and fuel prices, energy prices in Bangladesh have been very high for 2 years. Prior to this uprising, the only mass movements really that we saw were big protests called by the opposition parties around the cost of living crisis, not around elections, around the cost of living crisis. If the interim government cannot get a grip on the inflation problems that people are facing, it is going to be that is going to be where they lose their legitimacy and their space to operate. So that's what I'd say about the youth movement at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Husain. You talked about the grassroots organizations. They're coming up. Professor Rashid talked about cooperatives. Maybe they are the new faces to go with for empowerment from the middle class and the rest, led by youth. We are moving to Dr. Khan. Dr. Khan, what strategies can be employed, you think, to ensure that debt-financed development projects in Bangladesh prioritize long-term sustainability and youth interests rather than short-term political gains?
I would also like to address other people's comments, and let's see, how I can weave that in. Perhaps we can have more free-flowing discussion after. But in response to your question, which I'll start with, is you talk about short-term political gains, but Sheikh Hasina's government had been in power for 15 years without any challenge. Therefore, there was no need to focus on short-term gain. That government had a very sort of unique position where it was going to be in power for a long time, so it could very easily focus on long-term projects, which, in its vision, it would see through for decades, since, there was no question of giving up power, if you want to call it, if you want to look at it that way. The only problem is that there was no accountability, because the power just was there. So that was really not the problem. The problem was what kind of infrastructure was chosen. Well, one of the things that you can see when you look at the Jamuna Bridge is when that was completed in 1998, it led to substantial economic benefits by connecting the two parts of the country. And similarly, the Padma Bridge had that same kind of vision, and it linked up so many districts together. And that is the first thing you need if you want to disperse power away from the city itself and redistribute it to other places. So I think those projects are actually fairly beneficial. There had been so much concentration inside Dhaka, and that we all know was a problem. So reducing traffic congestion by having the expressways, the metro, and all of that, I don't think that that was a bad vision either. So the kinds of projects that we had, reducing concentration, ensuring better transportation and communication, having good internet and cell connections all through the country, ensuring that goods and services can flow around the country, well, it's very important for long-term growth. And this policy of infrastructure provision, in my mind, should be continued to the extent that environmental concerns are also taken into account. And the other thing to realize that in South Asia is whenever you have a construction project that entails a lot of money for a lot of people, it's kind of the site of corruption. So one thing that one can suggest for the interim government is what Barack Obama did in 2008 when he had the fiscal stimulus, is every penny was reported and written down for the public, and they could go and see what the money was spent on. And a structure to monitor the expenses down to the penny might be a very good idea that way. Now, these types of infrastructure projects, again, not having some really unique and different new vision, I will say that, going with the standard development projects are good for the youth. So I don't really have some, unique new vision in mind. But one thing I wanted to point out, which is very, very important for us, is the debt crisis is something we have to overcome now. And then we have to either refinance, we have to borrow again. So we have to think about where we're getting these funds and what kind of funds we're getting. One of the important things that Dr. Bhattacharya said today is that the data was wrong and that we haven't grown as much as we have, and that our GDP may be lower than what we think it is. And our population count is fine. So GDP per capita is much lower than we say that it is. In that case, how can we become a middle income country by 2025? We cannot. And if we don't, that is good news for us in a lot of different ways. We can access concessional loans that we thought that we couldn't. We can get the same IDA loans that we used to, and that would be better for us in this day of high interests to borrow such concessional loans. We should ensure that we take more environmental loans, because we are a unique country where the population pressure on the land is so heavy that, frankly, thinking about an agricultural-based development seems like a pretty tall order for me. Most of the land is now used for housing. And if people are to live, they have to have some place to live. So if you go out to the rural countryside, you see much more housing and far less land for actually producing anything. The other thing is we have terrible water shortage. So how are we supposed to keep growing grain at the rate that we do with the shortage that we have? So I frankly don't think relying on agriculture is the way to go for the future, but far more to have as much export of manpower as we can and to use very labor intensive, whatever production. So I'm not sure. I think the long-term problems are far more critical than we give due to, because we are the one country with the most pressure on land than any other place. So are we taking that into account adequately? The other couple of things I should say is that, we do have our exchange rate policy changed to a crawling peg. Now, it's uncertain exactly where that peg is going. So I think that the central bank and the finance ministry needs to have a more pre-announced and certain exchange rate policy that investors can look at so that they know what's coming. Because right now we're not sure really. And of course, the other thing we should look at is if you're going to take loans, then who is going to be monitoring the viability of those loans and whether those loans are the right loans. I think we need to really strengthen that capacity as well. So I'll leave it at that. And, I think it's wonderful that we're engaging with each other, and I hope that continues.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. You talked about transparency in government spending. You talked about reorienting focus on human capital, as Dr. Hussain also mentioned that, along with a few other speakers. Thank you again. Now, our next question is for Michael Kugelman, and it's about India. A seasoned legal speaker from Guyana recently said, to understand Guyana, we need to understand the United States and United Kingdom. Likewise, to understand Bangladesh, one may argue, we need to understand India. India makes up 70% of South Asia's population and 80% of its economy. India and Bangladesh are partnered for prosperity. However, I do repeat, however, public sentiment in Bangladesh can be paraphrased by adapting the quote of the Mexican statesman Porfirio Diaz, "Poor Bangladesh, so far from God and so close to India." Largely the reason being, paraphrasing author and filmmaker Satyajit Ray on how Britain treated India, India has given Bangladesh a lot, but India took more than it gave and keeps taking. So Michael, given the complex historical and economic ties between India and Bangladesh, how can the United States help foster a more balanced and mutually beneficial relationship between these two South Asian nations? Especially, how might American diplomacy address the perception in Bangladesh that India's influence is often overbearing, while still recognizing India's significant role in the region's stability and prosperity?
Yeah, thank you very much. A great question. Before I get to that, very briefly, I wanted to continue the spirit of responding and engaging with the other panelists. Very briefly, I think both Dr. Hossain and Dr. Khan made critical points that I just really want to amplify and foot-stomp. What Dr. Hossain said about how the economy has played such a triggering role for discontent, that's really important, because it's true that if you want to pinpoint the moment when one could argue that the BNP was able to demonstrate the capacity to mobilize and make a comeback, it was in December 2022, I believe, when it staged a pretty significant protest about inflation, not about politics, not about elections, about inflation. And also Dr. Khan's point when she was discussing the issue of water shortages and the impact that could have more broadly on longer term considerations about the economy. I don't think we talk enough about how climate change and its long-term effects could affect Bangladesh's economy. I think it's something that deserves a lot more attention and research. One more quick point I'll make on this issue of democracy development. I think it's important that on very specific concrete levels, democratic outcomes in Bangladesh are very closely linked to stronger development prospects. Two quick examples. We know about the story of poor labor conditions, poor labor rights in Bangladesh. This is something that was responsible for Bangladesh losing its GSP privileges with the U.S. when President Obama removed those about a decade ago. And also, this has deprived Bangladesh of more investment opportunities because the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, which is a key investment arm of the U.S. government, the DFC does not invest or will not invest in Bangladesh because of concerns about labor rights. And yet we've seen the DFC become increasingly active in the Indo-Pacific in recent years. It's certainly been very active in India, it's been active in Sri Lanka and other places, but because of labor conditions in Bangladesh, it's not willing to go there. And the second example here is if you talk about the internet, we've seen in recent years in the previous regime, significant levels of crackdowns on the internet, heavy policing of online content using the pretext of internet security imperatives. And this is something that I think makes it difficult to make a compelling argument to foreign tech investors that there's this receptivity to strengthening this notion of a burgeoning digital economy. And yet this is so important, so significant in a country that has been the target of considerable interest from tech investors overseas, including from important groups like the U.S.-Bangladesh Business Council. So with that, to your question about the U.S. and the role it can play vis-a-vis India and Bangladesh, I actually just published a piece in the Daily Star this week on this India-Bangladesh-U.S. triangle. I'm happy to make that available. So I think that answering your question, I think that we can talk about what the U.S. can realistically do and what it realistically cannot do vis-a-vis India-Bangladesh relations. What the U.S. cannot do is get India to change the way it views and approaches Bangladesh. That's just not an option, and for several reasons. First, India jealously guards its strategic autonomy. It will not let any other country, including a strategic partner like the U.S., influence its foreign policy, and especially a complex and sensitive relationship like the one that Bangladesh is now. Second, as a matter of principle, India, generally speaking, is not open to third-party mediations in its foreign policy. It just is not. And third, the U.S. has its own interests with India to be mindful of. It's not going to want to risk upsetting its ties with a key partner, and especially with Bangladesh, already having become a bit of a tension point between the U.S. and India. Washington knows that its relentless criticism of Hasina rankled New Delhi. It won't want to do anything else that could rub India the wrong way, and especially at a time when there's some considerable bones of contention more broadly in the U.S.-India relationship, from the issue of Russia to the Khalistan matter. So against this backdrop, for the U.S., for example, to pressure India to send Sheikh Hasina back to Bangladesh, or pressure India to send her to a third country, it wouldn't serve a useful purpose. India wouldn't listen to the U.S. on that anyway. It would just cause more tensions. I imagine that there's a process in place with New Delhi now to try to settle Sheikh Hasina in a third country. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming something is in play. And there's no reason for the U.S. to be weighing in on that. So here is what the U.S. can do on this issue of India-Bangladesh relations and making it a healthier, more mutually beneficial relationship. The U.S. can, as part of its routine engagements with India, of which there are many these days, it can share with New Delhi information, including intelligence, related to the security situation in Bangladesh, which presumably would provide an accurate picture, hopefully, and that would include showing a situation that does not show that pogroms are being perpetrated on the Bangladesh Hindu community, and it does not show a law and order situation that is complete chaos, as many in India have argued is the case. The U.S. could also convey to Bangladesh India's genuine concerns about post-Hasina conditions in Bangladesh, especially the increased space for hardline Islamists, and urge Dhaka to take such issues seriously, given that they are hampering, from India's perspective, getting a relationship back on track that Bangladesh itself, I think, has an interest in being a workable one. The U.S. can also provide more backing to existing arrangements involving Bangladesh-India relations that serve the interest of both capitals. So, for example, I think many of us have heard about this Bangladesh-India-Nepal electricity sharing scheme, which is very close to being done. Perhaps the U.S. can provide some financial or technical backing to it. The U.S. could also encourage India and Bangladesh to continue with their military exercises, their dialogues on border security, their trade relations, and so on. But, final word on this, I do think that there is some value to the U.S. doing less, not more, on the India-Bangladesh relationship. First, the new political realities in Bangladesh mean that India has lost a lot of leverage. It doesn't have the influence that it used to, and that has deprived it of the capacity to wield extensive influence and to be overbearing, quite frankly. It's been humbled, forced to step back, reassess. It doesn't have a trusted ally in power that welcomes and even protects and defends Indian influence. That's very different now. And second, let's not deny Dhaka and Delhi the agency they both have to try to fashion a healthier, mutually beneficial relationship. That'll be tough in the immediate term. India's not happy with how things are now. The return of Jamaat alone, quite frankly, will make it very uncomfortable about close engagement. I'm talking about India. But still, there is an opportunity for a fresh start. I'll end here. We are seeing high-level engagement taking place. I mean, Modi did not meet Yunus in New York, we know that, but Jaishankar met with the Bangladesh Foreign Affairs Advisor in New York. The Indian High Commissioner in Bangladesh has met with at least one top BNP leader. I wouldn't be surprised if India looks to strengthen engagement with the Bangladesh Army, which has long been robust, given that the army was loyal to Hasina over her 15 years of power until the very end. So there's something to be said for simply letting the situation play itself out without undue involvement from the U.S., which has had a tendency in this part of the world to cause problems when it tries to get involved in politics. Back to you.
Thank you, Michael, for your very balanced and articulate response. I cannot help stating this. Nietzsche once said, Germany is a great nation because its people have so much Polish blood in their veins. Many Bangladeshis believe in this context that India is great because India has so much Bengali blood and contribution in its history and its continuous journey towards prosperity. Professor Quadir, next question is for you. We are told that you were offered to be the chancellor at DevTraC University, but you decided otherwise. Rather, in light of the Education Ordinance 1973, you are now a proponent of a new discourse on post-secondary education in Bangladesh. We wonder what are the precursors behind your decisions and what are your insights for youth empowerment and engagement?
Mustahid, thank you. This is a wonderful question. In the last, I think, about 15 years of my academic life, I'm intimately involved with academic leadership, academic administration. And one of the things that most of us living in the global north is witnessing on a daily basis is the changing role of academic institutions in democracy and development. And what is really unfortunate for all of us to acknowledge that in Bangladesh, for numerous different reasons, the public institutions or private institutions, post-secondary institutions are not really engaged in any meaningful way, in any serious conversation about the role of academic institutions and student success or in democracy and development. It's entirely absent. And I was hoping that right after the transition to the interim government, there would be a kind of thick narrative around universities' role in fostering a culture of academic excellence or student success, etc., would become quite visible. That hasn't happened yet. I see some discussions primarily around the Vice Chancellor's appointment. It's fairly partisan, not just partisan, overly partisan, hyper-partisan practice that emerged in the last 15, 20 years. We also hear something about banning student politics. I don't really hear anything much about banning teacher politics as well. I think the last 15, 20 years, I would say about 2 decades, almost all institutions, higher educational institutions in Bangladesh became part of the problem. And we have to acknowledge it. We are part of the problem. There are 3, I think, specific roles universities now play apart from what they normally do, create critical thinkers. And in this, I think, domain where we are debating and discussing the role of the new university in the new context, you would not really see any significant presence of Bangladeshi institutions in these 3 specific areas. And it's critically important for a country like Bangladesh that is making an economic transition, political transition, to have these discussions and debates. One of which is the bigger question of the academic mission of the universities. What is our role? What is our academic mission? I think in the global north, we have come to slowly appreciate the fact that universities are no longer seen to be ivory towers. They need to be on the demand side of knowledge production. You cannot really maintain your identity as an island and expect to be always on the supply side of knowledge creation. I think that has changed. And part of the reason why that has changed is the rise of a thick, I think, debate about creating a better world. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, even if you disagree with the 17 goals, etc., one of the things that it does, and it does it so nicely, is to make us aware that we are living in an imperfect world. And in a country like Bangladesh, we see the imperfectness virtually everywhere. I think Michael talked about climate change a few minutes ago. Dr. Khan touched on a number of other issues as well. And also Dr. Hussain mentioned quite a few things about, I think, the challenges of developing in Bangladesh. So I think the time has come for Bangladeshi institutions to really have a discussion about their role in addressing some of the challenges facing the country today. How do you be part of this conversation, new narrative? It's completely absent. I don't see it anywhere. From my, I think, isolation also is probably difficult to see everything, but I normally don't get to see any of these things. The second one, I think, is also equally important, the role of academic institutions in creating a safe and positive space for debates and dialogues. In other words, the academic freedom issue. Indeed, in the last, I think, 15, 20 years, whatever the autonomous universities in Bangladesh had to produce new knowledge, knowledge that would be critical for the country to understand its own challenges of democracy and development, were not there at all. So this space not just shrank, it completely disappeared from the horizon. So there was no meaningful conversation about anything in Bangladesh. You're not able to even ask a question, whether it's a question about a government policy or a question about a particular practice or a trend. It is completely absent. Universities became almost absent as an actor in raising questions about anything fundamentally important to the country, whether it's about political institutions or governance or development. And I also think this is part of a sort of larger problem in the global north. Michael probably would agree that we are seeing a kind of rise of anti-intellectual populism in the global north. In the UK, I think we're also seeing that. It's a broader, widespread problem, but it's particularly a troublesome issue in the Bangladesh. When we grew up in Bangladesh as university students, we never really felt constrained by anything in the university system that I cannot speak up. There were, I think, a brief moment where the military stepped in and took over. I'm thinking of General Shah's takeover, when we couldn't really say anything. But other than those very brief moments, we were able to speak up. I think the last government made a sort of concerted effort to launch an assault on universities' academic freedom. I think that needs to be slowly restored, primarily for the purpose of giving our students an opportunity to know what is right and what is not so right. The universities have a role to play in promoting a culture of truth. The universities often play a role as truth tellers. In Bangladesh, we don't see that one. It's now, I think, the time for us to start discussing how do you create informed citizens in Bangladesh? How do you create that sort of environment where we can be politically engaged in a discussion and debate about different issues without the apprehension of being tortured or being jailed, etc. I think the last item is also equally important. The university's role in student success. And I don't define a student success from a sort of procedural point of view where you'll just hand in a diploma and say, look, you have a master's degree or bachelor degree, go on and do whatever you want to do. Yes, that's one aspect of universities' academic successes. One aspect of academic success, but the more important thing is to prepare students for their life after graduation. What would you do with a degree? And that was precisely the reason why the students took to the streets. I think the quota system was not necessarily about initially democracy. It really was about finding their place in the market. What do I do with a degree? Where do I go with a degree from a recognized institution? What future lies ahead? So universities in much of the world are now deepening students' connections with society, creating opportunities for their entrepreneurial spirit, and helping them, obviously, to become very successful as responsible citizens. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing any of those things in Bangladesh, and that's probably is the reason why, personally, I think it's important for us to have a really serious debate about the role of public institutions and private institutions in higher education in Bangladesh. I tend to think the primary reason why we are still trapped in the sort of 1940s teaching, learning, and research framework is the 1973's ordinance or act, university ordinance. Universities became, as I had mentioned earlier, political tools of the ruling parties to advance their political goals instead of doing the three different things. And if you look at the recruitment processes in almost all public universities, I'm separating public universities from private universities, right? Private universities have a different kind of mechanism in place. This is all politicized. Instead of banking on academic excellence or looking at academic excellence or merit, you're just looking at their political affiliation with a particular political organization to recruit. I think that has created a completely anti-intellectual environment in Bangladesh where academic excellence doesn't appear to be a concern for anyone. And this is the reason why I think if we are to really devise a kind of a strategy for Bangladesh development and democracy, this is time for us to start a conversation, a deep conversation, a spark conversation about the role of universities, both private and public, in democracy and development. I will stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Quadir. Our universities in Bangladesh are known as diploma mills, and our owners of factories and even IT data centers prefer to hire graduates from neighboring countries as managers to get things done. And these are public knowledge, and I hope that we sincerely hope your insights are taken into consideration by the interim government in promoting a culture of academic excellence. Professor Rashid, a number of panelists, even I see a question in the Q&A section from audience members. about the fear of Islamic radicalization in Bangladesh. Now, given your research on the impact of religion on economic development, how do you see the intersection of religious influences and governance structures affecting Bangladesh's economic growth potential, in particularly in relation to the 10% growth target you have discussed?
My research has been on England, not Bangladesh. And my conclusion is that Christianity was intimately involved in providing a climate in which capitalism could survive and England thrive. So let me be clear when we say about the role of religion. The short answer to your question is that it depends on what form the religion takes. There are many different versions of Islam, and there are many different versions of Christianity. Now, one would think a priori that the two elements that I think are fundamental to making for a peaceful transition are hope and patience. In some sense, one can say that religion is the opium that provides both. Be it so. Well, this is an abstract answer to your question. The specific answer to your question is, what is the role of what is called Islamism in Bangladesh's development? I have been visiting Bangladesh sometimes twice, sometimes thrice a year over the last decade. And even before that, I have been going quite regularly, about once a year. So I cannot say that I'm unfamiliar with Bangladesh. And on the basis of my familiarity, I would simply say this, that I don't see this as a real problem. And obviously, if people have access to some secret files or evidence about a deep-led conspiracy, that I do not know about. But what I see and I hear in our everyday conversation and from the people I meet, this is not at all a realistic problem. Do you want me to stop there, or do you want me to go ahead and talk about other things?
Oh, no, that's okay. Absolutely okay. We have 17 minutes, and we have one question for each of the panelists. So I would appreciate if we can limit our answers to a minute or so, maximum 2 minutes. I will also give you time from. So my next question is for Debapriya, Dr. Debapriya Bhattacharya. Dr. Bhattacharya, drawing from your experience with the UN Committee for Development Policy and as a former diplomat, how can Bangladesh balance its geopolitical interests with the need for transparent governance and youth empowerment to achieve its development objectives?
Thank you. That's quite a lot to respond to. Let me, as you have noticed that I've been trying to deal with more the applied policies struggling with at this moment. Obviously, I enjoy listening to my colleagues, and I agree with most, not all of them, not being at the same level or same with the same objective. So coming on the geopolitics, I think never in the history of Bangladesh we had been so much influenced by the geostrategic, geopolitical and China issue, but also it relates to the broader aspects of the Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific. And in the recent past, the issue of Gaza, Palestine, and also the other things happening in other parts of the world, or even with the rise of the right populist trends in in Europe. So I think if you look at Bangladesh, in some way it is a small economy, and relatively speaking, in terms of the size of the economy, not the size of population. So it cannot thrive without accessing the global markets. So when we talk about, so it will have to have a balanced international relation within which it will have to place itself. Whether it is in terms of getting its remittances, sending its people abroad to the labor market transformation, or for that matter, transitional finance and external resources to support its health, education, and social welfare. So, and the biggest global connection at this moment for Bangladesh is its contribution to international peacekeeping forces. So it remains one of the highest contributor to the UN peacekeeping forces. That is one is its exposure in terms of its commitment to global peace and also for a balanced relationship. So if you look at all the forms, and in the including in the recent past, we have been also very, very sensitive era of artificial intelligence and to improve our productivity, another form of accessing the global resource. Form you talk about, Bangladesh remains interested about that. And so thus it cannot really allow a political underpinning which it hampers our access to any of these global resources or inputs. And from that point of view, you will see that from the international perspective, the upcoming scheduled graduation from the least developed country groups, and I see it in the UN committee which approves those countries and inclusion of those countries. Bangladesh is very important that how it can really continue with this balanced and quite often sympathetic approach from the global community. And has been seen that in the major changes which has taken place is that if people would have given us, a bit of a backhanded compliment and support in terms of how we do our development, and would have overlooked some of the issues which will not be done in the future. For example, particularly when getting access to market to sell our export products, or to get access to concessional finance, or for that matter to getting access to privileged intellectual property products, one will have to be ignore our labor markets of the laborers and their freedom of trade. They lines in our for human rights issues in our own country, or how we treat our indigenous or religious minorities in this experience of the global. So the interdependence between with the humanitarian pillar. Can you hear me?
Yes, you dropped.
I am still dropped. I'm just finishing my last sentence. That what I'm trying to say that the new global order which is out there for Bangladesh to prosper, it has to have a balanced relationship with almost all countries in the world in order to ensure its access to global resources of all forms. And from that point of view, in the future, the development aspect has to remain mindful about the humanitarian aspects as well as the peace and security aspect, and not forgetting the human rights within the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. Dr. Hussain, shortly, are you kindly able to share your international perspective and expertise based on development studies? How do you think Bangladesh's approach to debt management and repayment compares to other developing nations? And what implications might these leave for the country's governance and geopolitical position in the coming years?
Well, thank you. That's a nice and difficult question. Bangladesh has, as you know, had historically quite low external debt levels. Macro fiscal stability was a huge priority for Bangladeshi governments from the 1970s onwards, after the massive economic crisis following which Sheikh Mujib was assassinated, and we had years and decades of military rule. So stability was very important. Debt levels were low. Very, very cautious economic governance was the watchword of the time. And then, of course, as Dr. Khan was saying, we have this massive boost in infrastructural spending, and I think the wonderful scholar Nusrat Chowdhury calls this infrastructural populism, where big spending on big showy infrastructure is used to show the country, how well we're doing, and to say, look, we're on your side. And this has now left us in huge debt. So somehow that's got to be clawed back. But I think what we're seeing now, of course, is that Bangladesh is now turning its face perhaps away from the East and looking back to the West again for protection support to fill the gaps in the public finances. And that's going to really change the geopolitics. It's going to change the human rights environment. Whether or not the West is terribly hypocritical about its human rights agenda with respect to the Middle East, we know it is. Nevertheless, it is quite happy to impose its human rights rules on countries like Bangladesh, which don't have the power to go elsewhere. And frankly, that's a good thing for us in some ways. I think in particular around issues like workers' rights, women's rights, and minority rights. So that's the way I think that the debt issue is going to play out for Bangladesh in the next few years.
Thank you, Dr. Hussain. Dr. Khan, as an expert on gender issues and indigenous peoples, how can youth empowerment initiatives in Bangladesh be designed to be more inclusive, particularly in addressing unique challenges faced by young women and indigenous youth in engaging with governance and economic development? Please stay within a minute or so. My apologies for the time restriction.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I don't know how long it will take me, because I'm going to put on my economics, international trade expert hat for a sec. And having been involved with trade liberalization in Bangladesh, I'd like to address the labor issue for a moment, because it's been sort of talked about, but not really. So we had fairly strong labor unions in our public sector enterprises all through the 60s and then the 70s and even during the 80s. Now, during the 80s, under a World Bank-led liberalization program in the entire country, there was privatization of most of these enterprises, and private sector development came about after General Zia became the leader of the country. That is the time when all labor unions were broken under the neoliberal idea of needing flexible wages and flexible labor policies. I was part of that, so I remember this all. And what did we get from then? The garments industry and various other private industries. But the garment industries, the R&G sector, was the biggest a thing that came about, and our RMG sector had no labor unions. They were completely, casual and migrant workers that had no power whatsoever. So once you have smashed the labor unions that were highly political and participating in the political processes, etc., aligned with parties, etc., how you want to rebuild that, because the US has given a lot of pressure about labor rights and not having unions. Well, the US was very complicit with the World Bank in smashing them to begin with. And so, how are they supposed to again emerge in a completely different type of environment that is very neoliberal, market-led, etc.? Okay, so that's one point I wanted to make. The other point I wanted to make was something that Dr. Quadir had said, is that we have not created enough of a democratic space over time. I just want to take an extra minute to address that, please, because I feel that the proliferation of the media, street protests, participation in the labor force, the extent to which women have been vocal in society is a sign of the creation of a liberal space. And I think that we have done that in Bangladesh quite well. I'm surprised at the way in which people are critical of the government in Bangladesh versus here. I don't see people being as intelligent in their criticism, and here you have this sort of anti-government thrust that it sort of is present in of course the right-wing areas as well as the left-wing areas of society. But in Bangladesh, I feel there's far more engagement, but at the same time, you had the advent of the robber barons, you had all of the inequality emerge, you had all that wealth creation happening at the same time. So we had, a mixed bag of things that happened in the last 30 years in Bangladesh, and we should really sort that out, in some kind of good analytical way. Because I've left myself so little time, I would like to just say that the peace accords of 1997 were not ever properly implemented. This is an opportunity to go back and see what has happened with the peace accords in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. The Chittagong Hill Tracts still have 400 military camps, 6 cantonments. What are they doing there? Why do the settlers need military protection? Why are the settlers able to go and burn villages again? What exactly, are we doing in the hill tracts? We've already made a demographic shift there so that I think the majority of the population right now are settlers. So is that the way to go? Is this a time that we can take to actually go back and see what we've done in the hill tracts, which is the most militant area of indigenous peoples that we have? Because, up north, most of the indigenous peoples are quite in a pathetic situation.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. It appears we have only a minute or so, and last question is for Michael. Michael, there are around 750 military bases around 80 countries as of 2021, 27 in 11 Middle Eastern countries. US spends more on the military than the next 10 countries combined. However, United States has only one military base in the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia. Our question is, will there be a new military base in the Bay of Bengal? What can you share with us, with the audience?
Yeah, so the short answer is that so far as I know, there are no plans for a new U.S. military base in the Bay of Bengal. I mean, even as U.S. strategic focus on the Indo-Pacific region has sharpened in recent years, it's accorded less attention to South Asia, to the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific. It has not been as focused on defense buildups and on strengthening its power projection capacities in the western reaches of the Indo-Pacific, as it has been with regard to East Asia. And that makes sense because America's treaty allies in Asia are all in East and Southeast Asia. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and the like. It has friends in South Asia, but no allies, only one strategic partner. I do think things have started to change a little bit in recent years. We've started to see more of a strategic U.S. focus on the Indian Ocean region because of China's increasing presence and perceived threat to the West in the IOR. But so far as I know, the U.S. strategic focus in this part of the Indo-Pacific still lags compared to East Asia. And, I would close by saying that I'm sure that you're alluding to the recent reports about this allegation that the U.S. is keen to build a base on St. Martin's Island. It's interesting. There's been conspiracy theories about this for many years. And I remember coming across some time ago a speech that the then U.S. ambassador to Bangladesh, Mary Ann Peters, made in 2003. And she said, this is a quote, "Let me go on the record to lay to rest. I hope for good a canard that continues on occasion to circulate in the press. The U.S. has no plan, no requirement, no desire for a military base on St. Martin's Island." That was 21 years ago. So this is something that clearly continues to come up nonetheless. Back to you.
Thank you so much. My apologies to Dr. Quadir and Dr. Rashid. Sorry, it's my inability. I was not able to time manage well because it's so exciting to learn from. But maybe in the follow-up one next year, let's see what we can accomplish and then have a follow-up conversation. And until then, thank you so very much for making the time for us and have a pleasant weekend ahead.